In 2018, I produced a video giving a detailed synopsis for what I would like to see in the next Predator movie. It involved a nautical theme and was set at the end of the 19th century. However, I'm not a Hollywood producer and I do not have any ties to the film industry. As a result, there was no way of me getting my desired film made. With the recent prequel Prey dividing the fanbase and retconning the Raphael Adolini story, I thought now would be a good time for me to re-edit this video. I will reintroduce you to existing Predator stories from literature that are perfect material to be adapted into feature-length movies. I'm Schizofenik, and these are my top 5 Yauta stories that should be adapted to movies. Before I begin the countdown, I will give one honourable mention. I have expressed on many occasions that Stefani and Steve Perry's AVP Prey is my favourite piece of Yautja literary fiction. In my opinion, the authors of this novel provided readers with the most engaging Predator story and well-described battle sequences. Originally a comic by Randy Stradley, Prey expanded on the comic and delved into the Yautja universe like nothing else has before or since. The authors imagined a predator culture that perfectly suited these creatures, and the book has almost become the Bible for any Yautja fan. So, if I admire this text more than any other, why is it only an honourable mention? Simply because of this: P.W.S. Anderson's awful attempt in 2004 to adapt Prey for the big screen. Since this film has already been made, it is highly unlikely that any production company would try to make it again, even by following the book more closely. Therefore, knowing this, I cannot place this text any higher. Also, please remember that this list is not about my favourite Yautja comics and novels, it is about which ones I feel could be best adapted to the big screen. With that said, we will turn our attention to my first entry. In yet another classic by Steve Perry, this story is set within a cold Alaskan forest where Ranger Sloan discovers the gruesome remains of mutilated Kodiak bears. This bear had met a violent end, he could feel that. So, where was the head? Convinced that a team of poachers are responsible for these massacres, Sloan tries to bring them to justice until he finds evidence of a far more dangerous hunter, the Yautja. This story introduces one of the most well-developed and fascinating protagonists in Sloan, a former Vietnam veteran who has a fascination with firearms. I feel that Perry undertook extensive research on gun types to make this character more believable and add realism to the text. As sniper rifles went, this was top of the line, the Shaytak M200 Intervention. You couldn't buy one unless you were military or in a police sniper unit. The rifle was capable of hitting a man-sized target at 2,000 meters and held the record at that range. With only 3 major characters to focus on, Perry really developed Sloan as well as his relationship with Mary, who he is helping in locating her brother. It is through a succession of nightmares that the reader discovers Mary's past, which both establishes her character and highlights her situation. I feel that these engaging characters would certainly transfer well to film and keep audiences interested in their stories and subplots. In addition to this, the book maintains a fast pace due to its short chapters, which would certainly be beneficial to audiences watching it as a feature-length movie. The pace, however, is slowed at times to match Sloan's patience as a sniper. This is particularly the case in his final encounter with a predator, which also alternates the points of view, giving the reader different perspectives on the same events. This would certainly translate well to the cutscene editing style employed by so many action movies. In regards to the Yautja, there are some intriguing moments of them hunting bears, which further establishes them as the deadliest of predators. The male brown bear stood more than 3 meters tall when it reared on its hind legs, probably ran 1,300 pounds. Not a record size, maybe, but big and mean enough. This creature danced around it, incredibly fast, slashing at it with long double wrist blades mounted on its right arm. The bear jumped, as if hit from behind, and then the other monster just appeared out of nowhere like magic. 2 of them. When I initially made this video in 2018, we already had 6 Predator movies that were set in the present day. What I really wanted to see is one that was set in the past. Since then, we have had Prey, which was released earlier this year and was set in 1719. However, I still feel that there are so many decades and centuries from the past that would make for fantastic historic backdrops for more Predator prequels. This brings us on to my 4th place entry. In the bloody sands of time, we are introduced to an American soldier, Joe Bob Cantrelli, who is blamed for the massacre of a drug cartel whilst on a mission in a South American jungle. However, when he reveals the harrowing details of what he saw to his CIA lawyer Griggs Irving, it is revealed that a similar incident occurred during the Vietnam War. When Griggs investigates further, he comes into possession of a French diary from World War I in 1916. In this diary, the French soldier Bernard recounts his horrific experiences of the Great War, stating that it was so hellacious that even the ghosts of the dead tried to escape it. Later, Bernard describes a battle with the enemy where he discovers the horrific remains of his decapitated lieutenant. Unable to determine the weapon used to cause such damage, the soldiers conclude that it must have been a madman or a voracious beast. Their fears are confirmed when they witness this so-called monster holding the skull of the lieutenant. Unable to believe their eyes, the soldiers wonder if the effects of the war have finally taken their toll on them as they question their sanity. Bernard later recollects stories from his fellow Parisians who reported ghostly sightings amongst the ruins after a bombing by the enemy. Later on during battle, Bernard witnesses his ghost killing both German and French soldiers. As the war rages on, we discover that Bernard was shot by one of the staff officers and died in hospital. However, will his diary be enough to prove Joe Bob Cantrelli's innocence? What Barry and Richardson achieved in this comic was to reinforce the notion that the Yautja have been hunting mankind throughout the ages. The prospect of an unseen predator slaughtering soldiers on both sides during the Great War is an intriguing one. We are led to consider the idea that it would be impossible to tell if a Yautja was hunting man during warfare because our own methods of killing were also incredibly brutal. Therefore, the decapitated and flayed bodies of the predator's victims would blend in with the horrors of the war. This comic also raised ethical questions around war, perfectly expressed in this quotation. Kill one man, you get the guillotine. Butcher a million, you're a national hero. As a result, both species are killers, and just like the predator, the more we do it, the more notorious we become for it. The concept of soldiers questioning their sanity after witnessing ghosts rising from the bodies of the dead is also highly believable. After witnessing the reality of death on a daily basis, it is entirely possible that soldiers may question their own eyes and believe a Yautja sighting to be a figment of their own imagination. This eerie imagery would certainly give any film adaptation of this comic a horror movie feel. At number 3, I have Stonewall's Last Stand, which is from the Predator anthology titled If It Bleeds. The story follows General Stonewall of the Confederates Army, who journeys into the dark woods with 5 of his best men in order to survey the field before battle with the Union soldiers. However, during the reconnaissance mission, he encounters a group of terrified Union soldiers who report that they have seen a translucent demon within these woods which has killed 9 of their men without them even getting a single shot off. As a result, this unlikely team of Confederate and Union soldiers are forced to work together in order to survive the woods. Robinson skillfully has these soldiers try to make sense of what they are seeing when they describe the cloaked predator as a shadow in the trees. Combined with the sharp shattering sound of the lantern striking the ground, it was disorientating, so much so that Stonewall's eyes betrayed him. Despite being ready for the brilliant display, he saw a shadow dancing in the trees above, as though alive, and before the light lost its powers, he swore the shadow was looking back at him. The men's uncertainty to what is hunting them combined with the dark setting of the woods is reminiscent of the original and in my opinion best Predator movie. I also feel that the haunting atmosphere of this story is by far the most eerie on my list and best suited to the horror film genre. Just listen to the following passage, which I feel elucidates my point clearly. "My mama's milk is the sweetest moonshine south of the Mason-Dixie," Johnny Boy replied. He was Crackerjack's opposite in every way. Short, fast, and sneaky. And while Crackerjack was most likely to strangle an enemy barehanded, Johnny Boy could stick a man a dozen times and bleed him out in half the time. "Quiet," Goose said. At first, Stonewall thought Goose was just keeping the men in line. But the stillness of Goose's body and the raised rifle in his hands meant that he had actually heard something. He spun in a circle, eyeing the darkness. "Ain't nothing out there." And then a voice. The garbled words were distant but unmistakable. Someone had been close enough to hear their conversation and was now mocking them with the words. Aside from the horror film aspect, the story also brings enemies together in order to take on a greater threat, which again reminds us of the original film where Dutch utilised the help of Anna. The unlikely team of soldiers also creates other narrative enigmas, such as if they can trust each other and work together as a unit. Stonewall pointed to Ames. "Give him a weapon." Goose looked stunned and then complied, returning the man's belt, which had a holstered pistol and sabre. "Fight with us tonight," Stonewall said, "and if you survive, you have my word that you'll be returned to your men unharmed following the morning's battle." After Ames had tightened the belt, he accepted a rifle with a nod. "I'm with you." This story also possesses some excellent sequences that combine action with horror, as Robinson describes. The creature turned its glowing eyes towards Goose, as though merely annoyed by his assault. The woodpecker growl made Stonewall's hair stand on end. It was the only part of his body able to move. Then the creature's shoulder came to life as a strange third appendage, like a malformed arm made of metal, snapped into place. A triangle of red lines cut through the dark, emerging from the side of the creature's helmet, creating red spots on Goose's chest. Goose took aim at the creature's torso and pulled the trigger, just as a burst of bright blue light exploded from its shoulder. Stonewall flinched away from the light, and the heat it threw off. He looked back in time to see Goose thrown against a tree, his body scorched. Finally, the end of this narrative is also extremely cryptic, and would surely make an audience try to make sense of it when walking out of the cinema. In second place, I have gone for Gordon Rennie's 1997 classic Nemesis. This story is set in London during 1896 and is told from the point of view of former soldier Captain Edward Soames. After returning to England from India, he immediately gets a telegram from a committee of high-ranking members of society. When he arrives at their club, he meets older sibling of Sherlock Holmes, Mycroft, who explains that in his brother's absence, he would like Soames to investigate a series of killings in the East End. Although the press believe that the killings can be attributed to the return of Jack the Ripper, Mycroft fears that it is something far deadlier than a prostitute-hating madman. With the backing of the committee and Her Majesty behind him, Soames takes this case and immediately visits the scene of last night's murder. Upon witnessing the aftermath, Soames admits that it reminds him of a killing he saw in India. The only remaining terrified witness from the murders can merely repeat one word, Rakshasa, which according to Soames were a race of man-eating demons banished by the Hindu god Vishnu. These events cause Soames to have a flashback of an encounter he had with a Yautja when in India 15 years ago. During his time in the service, he admits to leaving his friend to die at the hands of a predator. Completely ridden with guilt, Soames sees this as an opportunity to redeem himself for abandoning his comrade. It isn't until later, however, that Soames meets Sergeant Thackeray within the London Underground network that he sees the Predator's spacecraft, which has recently been discovered. Although the authorities believe the craft to be a German submersible vessel which transported the killer to London in order to destabilise the British Empire, Captain Soames disagrees with the notion. Realising that the Predator is using the Underground as his temporary trophy cabinet, Soames decides to return to this scene later that night, armed and ready for battle with his nemesis. This comic wonderfully explores themes of imperialism and redemption against a Victorian backdrop. It draws some fantastic parallels between the Predator and Jack the Ripper, exploring their brutal modus operandi. In addition to this, the comic highlights how for the first time a killer could commit murders in London and disappear into the vast metropolis. The Industrial Revolution saw England move away from small communities to large urban cities where anyone could blend in amongst the masses. It was here that Jack the Ripper managed to evade capture and where the Predator arrives to conduct his less discriminatory hunt. This comic is extremely well written and works as an extraordinary eclectic mix between the archaic and modern. I feel that a Victorian London setting will also bring a refreshing atmosphere to a Predator movie, creating a modern gothic horror feel. This setting certainly works for other science fiction monsters such as Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, who were also subsequently adapted for the movies. Last but certainly not least, I have my number one in yet another classic from the Queen of Predator literary fiction, S.D. Perry. This tale tells the story of Viking warrior Jarl the Swordson, who returns home with his warriors from their successful raids, only to discover 3 unusual messages awaiting him. 3 different messages had come from the north weeks apart to carry the news. The first item related that Skled the Boarstooth had been killed by warlord Asker the Spear, who had taken Skled's lands as his own. There had been a great bloody battle in the early fall, and Asker and his men had won. The second story was that Asker had gone mad and was burning the farms and villages near Skled's keep, slaughtering livestock and driving people into the wilderness. The latest was that Asker was dead and had been dead since the day he had taken the keep. It was Skled and his council who were murdering everyone within reach. They had risen from their graves as Drugar as the long wet days of the fall had crept into the early days of winter. Despite not believing in ghost stories, Jarl was intrigued by the notion of claiming Skled's keep for his own, as he felt disrespected by the dishonourable warrior some years ago. However, not all of Jarl's men share in his lack of superstition, as Almar, much like Billy from the original movie, is clearly perturbed by the reports. Almar was strong, a good fighter, and was also the most superstitious man Jarl had ever met. He was full of lore and always carried charms and fetishes to battle. He stood reluctantly. There are times when a willful man dies, he becomes a Drugar, Almar said, his low voice a rumble within the warm lodge. The Drugar are not alive, but stalk the living, eating their flesh and drinking their blood. They swell and grow tall, some as tall as giants, and they can weigh as much as an ox. They can't be killed. Burn them, or chop them to pieces, and burn the pieces, and throw the ashes into the sea. And that is all I know of Drugar. He sat down, nervously fingering one of the charms he wore on a string around his neck. Despite their uncertainty towards Almar's zombie tales, Jarl decides to go to Skled's keep and slay whatever awaits them. Together, with 16 loyal fighters, they sail to their destination. It is upon their arrival that we discover that they are being stalked by 4 predators on a hunt. The 3-blooded Yautja are led by an elite named One-Eye, who is developing their skills on this hunt. As they make their 2-day journey towards Skled's keep, they feel the presence of an invisible enemy. Skled's keep was 2 days from shore. In the morning they started east, collecting squirrels and rabbits in the woods along the way, a winding climb into the hills, lightly dusted with snow. They passed a handful of small farms and found them as empty as the fishing village, dead fires and signs of hurried packing, footprints in the rotten wet leaves where the snow hadn't yet gathered. Some of the men laughed at first, joking about the fearful farmers running from Drugar, but as the day wore on, the laughter fell away. The woods and snowy fields weren't only empty but silent, a watchful tension in the air that all could feel. Helter, who had the best eyes, saw branches move without the wind thrice. Bjark, Olav and Havid had heard steps beneath the barren trees. The information that they were watched, followed, was passed casually from man to man, and just as casually, Jarl slowed their pace and put his hand on the hilt of his sword. However, when they arrive at the farmhouse, they discover that all the pigs have been slaughtered and the farmer and his family have met the same grisly fate. With human teeth marks visible upon their bodies, are the stories of Drugar true? It is during their camp at night that 2 of the younger predators give up their position and are forced to engage 3 of the watching guards. Despite killing the guards, the 2 predators are injured and the rest of the warriors are aware of their presence in the woods. The elite demands that the 2 disgraced predators must continue without any armour or weaponry, whilst the other young Yautja hunts the Viking warriors who make their way to Skled's keep. There are clear parallels between the predators and Vikings, as they both seem excited by engaging a deadly unknown enemy. They also embrace the possibility of dying honourably in battle, with the warriors seeing it as a gateway to Valhalla. What better feeling than to head into battle with skilled men, united against an unknown foe? They would win or they would die, and both had their rewards. When the warriors finally arrive at Skled's keep, they are met by the raving inhabitants, now plagued by sickness. As they attack, a brutal and bloody battle ensues, involving the Vikings, the Plagued Ones, and the Yautja. I must confess that this story does remind me of John McTiernan's 13th Warrior, which I did enjoy. I feel that a movie adaptation of this story, however, could surpass even that and prove highly successful with audiences, particularly with the recent popularity of TV programs such as Vikings and Game of Thrones. This story also has a very fitting ending that will leave you satisfied and would certainly work in a movie. It is for all the previously mentioned reasons that I believe this story would be best adapted to a feature-length film. Although I have ranked my top 5 stories, I would be more than content seeing any one of these texts turned into a feature-length movie. I feel that every piece of literature on this list provides a far more compelling story than some of Hollywood's attempts, but let's just hope they're not retconned for the worse. It is for these reasons that I have made this video, hoping that a production company will buy the rights to one of these stories and turn them into the movie that all us Predator fans want and deserve to see. Please let me know what you thought of my choices and which of my top 5 you would most want to watch. Alternatively, which Yautja literary texts were not on my list that you would want to see in a future Predator film. If you can't wait to see these stories adapted into films, I might be able to offer you the next best thing. I have made full-length audiovisual comics of Skled's keeper Nemesis, which you can watch here. This was Schizofenik, and I hope that you will be back for more Predator-related content on this channel soon. Take care.